So this is an example of the last TIF that we've done in Sioux Falls. So this is TIF 21. Just a little background on this property. The city owned this whole vacant lot here. And this whole area, even where you see that building, this was an old rail yard area that was removed back in early 2000s. And ultimately, the new road was put into place to kind of facilitate and provide some development opportunity along here. The city owned that land. And we've worked on issuing a number of RFPs along this stretch that ultimately ended in a redevelopment. So this was one site that the city still had remaining. We understood when we went into this project, when we offered this up, the contamination associated with this project. Actually, what we did then is we went through an RFP process. We got several submittals of developers wanting to develop by the property from the city and redevelop it. One of the submittals ended up coming in was Lloyd Companies in Sioux Falls. They wanted to redevelop this, but they also had put under contract the buildings that you see on the right-hand side of that photo, which were very blighted buildings, but also had some major contamination associated with that. So there was a lot of petroleum deposit, as well as there was some battery cracking and some other things done back in the day in the basement of those buildings that really created a lot of contamination for this site. So ultimately, we awarded them the RFP and selected them to be our developer. But with their request, or with their proposal that they submitted, they had told us that TIF was going to have to come with that. And so what we did is we started to sit down with them, reviewing their project cost. We had a lot of details with a lot of that stuff already, because we required them to submit it as part of the RFP. You know, what's your project cost, what are the things associated with that. We reviewed the TIF with them. Some of the things that they wanted to see, but also the city wanted to see, was we have kind of a streetscape plan for the downtown area, that we want to see a consistent streetscape that includes landscaping, some bump out areas, art. And so around the site, some of the eligible expenses were some of the streetscape and sidewalk and road improvements that both the city and the developer wanted to see. But the main cost of this TIF, or the main reason for the TIF, was just the environmental remediation that was needed, the removal of the blighted buildings as well. And ultimately, again, through those initial conversations, reviewing sources and uses, pro forma, getting that third-party review, ultimately we ended up with agreeing that the financial gap of that project and what was needed through TIF was $4.1 million. And that's less interest, or less finance costs. So we approve ours less finance costs, and then we always calculate or add the finance costs in separately. So ultimately, we capped financing costs at $1.8 million. And I believe that was like a 4.5% interest rate we capped at as well for this one. Ultimately, so the total estimated reimbursement for this, or maximum reimbursement for this, is $5.9 million. But as you can see on the right-hand side, you can start to see this development is underway here in Sioux Falls. So it's not in Sioux Falls, it's not completed yet. What it entailed, they removed that whole 2.5 acre site, had underground parking underneath it. They had to remove all the dirt. They actually had to go deeper than what the basement of the garage was, just because of the amount of contamination and some of the requirements of the DENR as they looked at the level of contamination. So they actually had to dig it down and build it back up a little bit. There's also a quartzite in this area, so there was some blasting that was necessary. I think there was quartzite where they didn't need it, and not any where they needed it. So, but
they were stuck between a rock and
but ultimately, this is a redevelopment in our uptown area, which has been an area that we've offered a lot of city property up for. It's an area that we've continued to want to see redevelop. Just across the street is our Falls Park, and we're just getting underway with building the Levitt Shell across the street. This whole uptown area of downtown is really also another area that has benefited from the the city offering up land redevelopment, but also working with the developers with tax increment financing, as was that other area I showed you earlier. So.
This will be a multi-story building, 2 buildings, ground floor commercial or retail, and then just over 200 units of apartments.
So we talked a little bit about how we certify expenses. So, you know, really when we were looking at certifying expenses, this is after the TIF's approved, after the project's completed, they start to submit their invoices for what those projects are. In our earlier TIFs, we didn't break out really the eligible expenses. We just said the ultimate TIF amount is this amount. That's what we'll pay up to. In our more recent TIFs, like I said, we've gotten more specific on some of them, on capping certain levels of reimbursement for eligible expenses. So ultimately, we have to review that. You know, actually capping a lot of those things makes the review process a little bit more difficult, because we're reviewing to make sure that, one, they're not over the general number of the TIF, 2, they're not over the financing or the rates or any of those things. But they do ultimately benefit us in the long run. Also, a lot of our recent TIF agreements have gotten pretty specific in what actual developments are. So in our development agreements or our TIF agreements, we specify what the developments are going to be, and they need to build to what they said, because if they build less than that, project costs are different. Do they truly need the TIF financing again? And so ultimately, if they don't build it to those specifications within the agreement, we have the ability to either reduce or not reimburse the TIF eligible expenses. We're only reviewing for the cost in that 5-year window, and we're only, you know, we're only reimbursing for the actual incurred costs. So again, like that Sanford example, where that sports complex example, ultimately we did have $10 million worth of eligible expenses. We approved it for $10 million of eligible expenses, but we're ultimately only going to be paying out 5.3 because that was the actual cost of what was done within the 5-year period.
So do you go by what was actually expended, or do you also, like, some of ours, it's, well, we're under contract, so we're committed?
It has to be expended within the 5 years from the creation of the district. We had, this is an example of that a little bit, where this is a TIF district that we recently closed out. It was called the Williams Pipeline Site. It had an old pipeline site on it. Originally, it was its original use. Ultimately, you can see it was really just a greenfield site, but we were really worried about the contamination associated with this site. And it ended up being its location where Costco is in Sioux Falls. And ultimately, there's about 250, 260 apartment units that were a part of this project as well. After further review of some of the contamination actually came in a little less than what we were expecting. We entered into an agreement of $2.9 million for this TIF district, and they ultimately the environmental came in quite a bit less. And if you want to go to the next slide, Patsy, we ultimately only paid out $973,000. So this was a TIF that was created for $2.9 million, based on, you know, the level of valuation that increased. We increased the property by $24 million based on the Costco and the apartment complex that happened. Ultimately, the area that got reimbursed was just for the apartment complex. They were the ones that were seeking after they did further review of the contamination on site. It was just the portion of the apartment where the apartment complexes were where the actual reimbursement occurred, but the whole district helped benefit and pay this off. But this was one, to your previous question, where right at about the 5-year mark, there was a project that they were looking at doing. There was an eligible expense that they completed, but it wasn't. There was still some work that could have been done on it. So they came in right around. Actually got, I think, some estimates before the time of the 5-year period, but didn't get it completed, and ultimately we didn't reimburse that part of it. But this was a successful TIF in that there was only a 6-year TIF that, you know, got paid off, and the reimbursement and the eligible expenses came in a lot less than originally projected. And then reporting, this is something new that we're doing with the city council. Our finance officer does a monthly financial report to the city council at one of our informational meetings, so once a month he does these. We've always had our TIF fund and the amount of the TIF fund on the spreadsheet, but a lot of people had a lot of questions of, well, there's multiple TIFs, so how does this all work? And so what we've done in that financial report is just breaking it out. And there's a lot that's not on this sheet, but this is really what our council is looking for seeing, just so they could see where we're at with some of these TIFs. And so you could see just kind of the years in which we believe the district to be, what the base value is, what were the base taxes, what's the current value and the current taxes. They can calculate the increment from there that we're receiving every year. They can see what we've paid to date for each of these. And then on the very right-hand side, this was, we're presenting on this just the project cost, less financing. So a lot of these, if you look at the first couple there, you can see that, well, you approved it for 1.5, but you've paid out 2.9. And that's because we're not including finance costs on here. And the reason we've not is because every one of these has a different interest rate and everyone's financed a little bit differently, and we've capped them all a little bit differently. So it creates some confusion on each of these when they're all a little bit different. So we answer those questions when they come up by the counselors, but just for the sake of this presentation and this sheet that we provide them monthly, it doesn't change. And ultimately, we're only receiving increment or payment of increment from the county twice a year, so this sheet's only really going to change a couple times a year to let them know what we've paid to date and if any of them have come off because we closed them out.
This is what we call our TIF dashboard.
Yeah.
The city council has requested.
Quick question on certification again. You mentioned that part of your process is to make sure they built what they said they were going to build. Is that's just in relation to like they remove the amount of soil that they said they were going to remove to remediate, or put in the sewer line they said they were? I mean, the buildings that create the increment are,
Right, this is.
they're not promised as part, I mean, they're
In the TIF
planned,
plan.
but not,
Yep.
you can't certify something that might not happen 7 years down.
Right,
or
in
7
the
years down
plan,
the road.
within the first 5 years, we've identified what those reimbursable costs are going to be. And that's what,
And that's what
we verify.
that's what you're verifying,
Yes.
that those.
the rest of the project, we don't take a look at,
So
other
we-
than those reimbursables.
So we have gotten a little bit specific in some of them. So the last example, that TIF 21 example,
Uh-huh.
we did an RFP and they committed to building what they said that they were
Oh,
going to
In
build.
that case, yeah.
I got you.
And
Yes.
so in instance, there are some instances where we've sold city property. And so in those instances, we have required further commitments from them in terms of what they're building. So,
That's
so
through
we
a
do get
separate development
specific
agreement.
into, that agreement said you had to have a minimum of 20,000 square feet of commercial space in that building. And it said you had to have a minimum of a certain amount of units. And they were also going to add parking, so they had to do a minimum of and they were lower than what was expected, but we didn't, we thought there was going to be 250 units. I think the limit was 200 or something. But so they may come in a little less, but we've committed them to making sure, especially when we're selling property, that we're getting what they said that they were going to give us, because we did go through that public process. And so when a TIF's factored into that, sometimes there's some conditions related to the actual overall project too.
And a timeline when they have to
Yeah.
construct it?
So on some of those too, when it comes to city property, we've identified a start date and typically a date of finish for those projects. Now we have the flexibility if we know they're working on it and stuff to grant extension, but I mean, we do have outlined timelines in a lot of those developments related to city property. It's another thing that we've also thought about in terms of just not just the city property ones, but I think going forward, we are going to consider looking at putting in our TIF agreements that this project needs to be completed within, or started within 24 months or 36 months, because we've had a few that, again, they get issued a TIF and then they don't start a project. And ultimately, then if they don't start it soon enough, we may have to amend the plan. And so that just creates a lot more, and you know, we've issued this with the understanding that the project would move forward, so.
So like we've had some that have improved with different components in the project plan that don't happen. And, in fact, there was one that they wanted to certify, but they hadn't done one of the components, and I said, you need to go get approval from the council because they may not have approved your TID had they known you weren't planning on doing this component. And so ultimately, he wanted to ask the council for permission, and they said, no, you build it. You said you're building it, you build it, and that TID will never pay off. Not in the 20 years, anyway. We've had other TIDs that they promise all these structures and all this increment as part of the project plan, and then they sell it to a nonprofit, or they don't build it in the timeline that they want to. And again, you prolong then when you start receiving those increments, and it costs you more in interest fees, and it costs you more down the road because now your project costs have increased, and then they come back and ask for amendments because the project costs increased. So there's so many variables that when we're looking forward, and Patsy's probably better at doing this because she's got more recent experience, but we want those timelines in. We want where you need to have the improvements in, you need to have some construction going, you know, at certain benchmarks, because